Hello, and welcome to this panel on public service media. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and I'll be chairing this conversation today. I have with me a set of public service news leaders that I really personally respect and have learned a lot from. And I'll be moderating a discussion where I hope everyone has a chance just to hear from them both about the things that they feel they've achieved, but also how they think about some of the challenges that public service news media face across the world. I think the starting point is to recognize that we are in the company of people who work at, I think, some of the most respected public service media organizations in the world, and we also should recognize that that term is sometimes used very loosely, and there are public service news organizations in the world where one has every reason to question whether they are in fact genuinely independent of government and parliamentary majorities. And there are also some that I think we ought to call state media rather than public service media. These are not those media. So I recognize many people in the room will live and work in countries where these things are far more challenging. But the reason we brought together this group is that even in these cases that all of us care about, there are some very real promises, but also some very real perils facing public service news. If we just sort of start with the good news, it's not only in press releases from public service media organizations that you will hear about the important role that these media play in our societies. You can also read shelves full of independent academic research that documents the role of genuine independent public service media in our societies. They are generally amongst the most widely used sources of news where they exist. They are often the most, or amongst the most highly and broadly trusted sources of news in the countries where they are genuinely independent. They also play an important role in reaching parts of the public that aren't necessarily well served by commercial providers. And furthermore, research documents not only that people learn about politics from following public service news, but also that engaging with news, including news from public service, can leave people more resilient to misinformation and information operations from foreign states and other actors trying to subvert public dialogue. But at the same time as we can document this good news, crudely put, about the role of public service in society, we also, of course, can document a lot of challenges. And these are the ones that we want to hear about how my fellow panelists are navigating in each of their organizations. Some of them are well-known and old challenges. Public service media face recurring attacks from different parts of the political spectrum, often, but not only, from the political right. Naja works at the BBC, which is often attacked by members of the governing Conservative Party, but has also faced a large volume of criticism from parts of the Labour Party aligned with the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. They also face relentless criticism from private sector publishers who keep insisting that public service news provision crowds out private players. They have not so far produced robust evidence that this is in fact the case. I think I need to sort of just note that generally independent research suggests that public service news does not crowd out private providers and may in some cases in fact be aligned with increasing people's interest in news that can in turn be provided by more specialized private providers. And of course they face what is in some ways perhaps the most central challenge, which is losing touch with much of the public that they serve. So just using a few data points on the BBC, not to single out Naja, but just it's an organization that more of you probably have some sense of than some of the others on the panel. In just the last 5 years, the BBC's news reach across the British public, across all platforms, online and offline, has declined by 11%. In just 5 years. Anyone who's worked in a newspaper will have memories of what it feels like when decline starts to reach such a tempo. The BBC, of course, also operates in an environment where there are challenges around trust. The BBC is amongst the most highly and broadly trusted sources of news in the UK, but trust has declined by 19% in the same 5-year period. Interestingly, it's still trusted by a majority also on the right. The biggest declines are amongst people who feel alienated from political life, which is a large part of the UK public. So it's not so much about partisanship and more about parts of the public who feel left out, also from the media. And then, of course, there are new challenges that all of you face, not just the BBC, the rise of streaming services, audio platforms, other platforms, and in the future, generative AI. But instead of admiring the problems, which academics like me can excel at diagnosing and dissecting, I think we should talk about how one responds to them. So I've made a few points about the BBC, so I think we should start with you, Naja, and just hear from you about how you think about the role of public service news from a BBC perspective, and then how you think about navigating these challenges that you face as an organization going forward.
Thank you, Rasmus. So I'm emotionally kind of split in two halves. There's a lot of stuff that is concerning me, but I'm also seeing a ton of green shoots, and I'm optimistic is maybe too strong a word, but I really think with dedication and determination that it is possible for public service media to be the service that people deserve, and that really I fundamentally really believe that it is it's kind of one of the infrastructure's foundations that is either creating a healthy society or not. I think it is the foundation of a big ecosystem of private media. And I think we're going to hear from Anne later. A lot of the Scandinavian countries, they're now showing, they're really, you can see in the audience numbers, they are in touch with the younger generation. So I'm very optimistic. I'm also very concerned. I think my main concern is as a journalist. I'm really concerned for the independence of journalism. I feel that we need to be more courageous than ever before, pursue truth with no agenda, without fear or favor. It's easy to say without fear or favor, but what it means for our employees is that people are losing their lives or are close to. We have to work with people that are working, that are being pursued, that have to flee their countries, leave their countries, never come home. We have lifted people out of Afghanistan, Russia, the whole Iran, you know, just covering what is going on in Iran, constant attack of our people. And one of our younger stars, Mariana Spring, that does a very important journalism about disinformation on the internet. The threats that are coming her way, you cannot, I mean, and it's not just coming from crazy people. Some of this is organized, and it's coming from bad actors. So that makes me very concerned. It also makes me think that the whole discussion about do we need public service media is really, I don't know, I find it a bit, I mean, I hope it doesn't sound arrogant, but I think it is a bit of a futile discussion, because I don't see any evidence in the world we live in that you don't get a more informed public if you have strong public service media that are independent and are allowed to pursue truth. And I'm going to come back to what we do more tactically, but I think what we have been thinking a lot the last years about why we are here. You know, why are we here? Maybe you heard our Director General set out the future for the BBC direction of travel. Our mission has always been inform, educate, and entertain, but we've translated that to this age into the pursuit of truth with no agenda, back British talent, but creativity in a wider sense. And number 3, bring people together, because we know people have a very strong need to belong and see how they belong. And I think these 3 fundamental things are more needed than ever. Sorry, speech over.
I can't resist the temptation to try to push you a little bit on one thing you said.
Welcome.
We're at a journalism festival. When we open up for questions from the floor, perhaps someone will stand up and make the case for more cowardly journalism, but I doubt it. So do you mind saying a little bit more about what courage and independence means domestically, because you mentioned a couple sort of bad actors. No one likes bad actors. You mentioned some foreign governments that probably have relatively few sympathizers at an event like this. But what about the home front? I mean, there's been quite a lot of sort of suggestions that the BBC is being bounced by the government. So can you share with us a little bit more about how you think about the independence of the BBC in the UK?
So I think that the criticism is good, right? It's very good. We belong to everyone, so of course everyone is entitled to have an opinion about what we do. I can just say from the inside, we are absolutely pursuing all critical stories, everything that is worth investigating, holding power to account, and that goes for the monarchy as well as the government. And as Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are leading all the polls, we are also putting, because that is an obligation of public service, putting more resources into investigating their plans and the feasibility of those. So I think that's one thing, but I think there is another element of courage. And I was there yesterday. I had the privilege of spending all day together with a group that we have at the BBC that is the next generation panel. So that's a group of 20 of our most talented young people. And they show me what modern courage is, and that is also allowing yourself to be transparent, honest, vulnerable in a way. And the way we translate that is that if you look up some videos from BBC Verify with Merlin Thomas, you will see how she goes to lengths we have not done before in explaining what do we know, what don't we know, how do we know it, how we found out, what is the difficulties with the stories. And I believe very much, I believe the BBC needs to be an authority, but I think a modern authority is not a general or a commander. A modern authority is someone people trust and will follow and will listen to, but I think that requires an honesty. It also means that we, more than I think we've ever done, is we are very, very fast and very loud when we correct our mistakes, and at the exact same prominent spot as we made the mistake. And it's really, you all know newsrooms, it's very hard to kind of, admit that you've made an error, but we think maybe humility or honesty, transparency is more needed because people don't, especially younger people, they won't trust us just because we're the BBC. Some of them actually quite the opposite, because someone has fed their brain with conspiracy theories about all the establishment is full of and you can't trust anyone, and all those lazy, easy tropes. And because we are so big, and because we've always been here in young people's perception, it's only 100 years, right? But still, then it's easy to think, it's all media, and then it's the BBC. And that means that we've seen that with the Israel-Gaza war, for instance, that a lot of our trust has increased during the war, which I think is admirable for ourselves, our teams, when you think about how divisive this event is. But we can see, especially younger people that gets most of their information from TikTok or other places, they get someone's translation of what we do. Someone saying, look at this headline, there you can see the BBC is pro-Israeli, or there you can see they're all pro-Palestinian. And it's, of course, always lifted totally out of context, but it's the reality that a lot of people, we are not owners of kind of telling the story about ourselves. So that means that we think that inside our storytelling, we need to be more clear about why you can trust us and not just take for granted that people should.
Thank you very much, Naja. So, Renée, I'm going to turn to you next, because I think in addition to your general experience and insight into the environment and how it's changing, it's also interesting to hear about your thinking specifically from an ARTE point of view, as a different kind of public service provider with a different remit than the sort of, crudely put, general interest public service media that both Anne and Naja represent. So, you've taken over at ARTE as head of news. How are you navigating these challenges?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Good, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Naja. It's interesting what you've sort of outlined about the risks and challenges and opportunities are a way for me to talk about how kind of unique an opportunity actually public service media is in needing to be and having the privilege of being able to be quite different and differentiating from private media. So what do I mean by that? Well, ARTE, for those of you who don't necessarily know, is actually not a national public media. It's a European public media. So it's very unique in that we don't have the same political pressures often or sort of national identification as a country's national public service. So what does that mean? I mean, that means that we have a quite unique genre of news where it is really, ARTE in particular, we don't really do commodified news or hot news. We are much more focused on news magazines, on documentaries, and on longer form stories. So this is a rare opportunity, right? Because these are the most expensive, the most difficult, the most challenged, I think, in today's media economy across the board, I think even at public service networks. And, you know, a public service network has the rare privilege, and I come from someone who's, you know, I started at ARTE in September after having been at a for-profit private news media, which was actually one of the rare profitable media in the world, so a lot of pressure to adhere to a business model with a revenue stream. It is an incredibly rare responsibility, but also privilege to be able to create a kind of differentiating, contextualizing, analytical journalism in a period in which it has never been more important to make that kind of journalism relevant to audiences today. But that's where I think actually the biggest challenge lies for public service media, is remaining relevant. Because all of us come from traditional linear audiovisual broadcasting organizations. Becoming relevant to audiences for whom broadcast is no longer a platform that's as relevant as digital platforms, whether it's social media or online or streaming, really allowing the kind of differentiating journalism that we have the privilege of making because of being publicly financed is difficult, actually, if we need to sort of think about how to find the audiences for whom this makes the greatest difference. And that kind of transformation aspect in combination with the deep public responsibility and the pressure still to remain viable, because financing for public networks is being reduced across the board in every single country in Europe, including in, you know, the 2 countries and the European Union that finances ARTE, not to mention in the countries where public service media is being gutted entirely. So, you know, we have this rare opportunity, a really unique challenge, which is probably a challenge shared by almost all media is remaining relevant in, you know, as audiences and user needs change. But I think it's a particularly intense pressure when we have responsibility to be reinforcing and understanding better than ever how to be a trustworthy media that's also interesting and relevant, because they're the same, really. And I think the last piece that I want to mention is that, as the research has shown that your institute, Rasmus, has done a lot of, there is no place in the world right now where there's not a reduced trust in media, but the proportional reduction for public service media is measurable, and it's across the board. And I think that reinforces more than ever, you know, in a time, and that's sort of the last word, you know, trust has become like almost a buzzword, like it's all we're talking about. But it's actually very real, because even for private sector media, if people don't trust you, they're not gonna read you. And people might not even be conscious, audiences might not even be conscious of making an identification with trust. But because news resistance has never been on the rise ever as much as now, and younger audiences are the ones who are most news resistant and cutting even more, they might not want to talk about trust or not trust, but that's still what we have to engender in order to become relevant to them.
I'll just ask you to say a bit more about the money side of things, right? So imagine for a moment that I'm not me, but my nephew, who's a plumber, and who not so long ago made his living installing toilets on the 4th floor of sort of social housing projects being renovated. If people are using public service less and less, why should he keep lugging toilets to the 4th floor to pay for it? What is the case that you would make to a citizen for why more public resources or the same level of public service resources should be invested in something that fewer people use?
Excellent question, especially I think in the context of a network like ARTE, perhaps different from Sweden or the UK, because there is a perception, probably not unreal, that, for example, the kind of news that we produce is elitist. And so if on top of that, it has to be sort of financed by every taxpayer, I think that begs the question ever more in an atmosphere where people are increasingly not only distrustful of media, but actually aggressively resentful of what they view as being vehicles of power or narratives that are untrue or being manipulative. And I think that's where the responsibility of public service media is ever stronger. And I think, Naja, you mentioned this to some extent, to be a reflection of the people who are financing it through tax contributions, or even by giving us their time when they could be going down a deeper, more comfortable, more familiar, more reinforcing bubble of content on social media. So that, again, speaks to my question of relevance. For me, relevance is not just, and it's a lot, about formats and narrative and being in the right vector and the right kind of writing and experience for users, but it's also about being the image of the people who you are serving, or being a reflection of their voice. It's not necessarily about interaction, but it's about understanding your audiences, and I think that actually is one of the greatest risks. I would be curious to hear from Anne and Naja about this. One of the greatest risks, especially when you're running a big organization, is actually having your ear to who's watching and who's not watching, and who are you? And that's actually very difficult.
I am tempted just to ask Anna, who are you? But I will frame it by saying that, even by the high standards of the organizations represented here, Swedish television is amongst the best in class in terms of your performance, high reach, high trust, also a higher reach with younger people than many of your peer institutions across of Europe. Can you share a little bit more about how you have navigated some of the issues that Renée in particular highlighted? If I'm a citizen also in Sweden, I might, instead of going to Swedish television, I might go down an angry route and, read alternative news media or tabloid or partisan news media, or spend lots of time on very curious communities on social media. If I want something more comfortable, I might just spend my time with Netflix and Spotify. So how does Swedish television fit into that with news, but also your role now is much broader than that?
We are not seeing a decline in trust. 70% of the Swedes trust us, and only 8% don't, which is the highest number of all media companies in Sweden. And 8 out of 10 Swedes use us. So I think to stay relevant and to make people wanting to pay the licenses, they have to use us. And even if we are in a good spot, I'm always in a state of kind of a positive panic, because so much is happening, and we are extremely challenged, and we're obsessively trying to understand where the audience is going, and we're trying to make strategic bets, and we made a brave one in 2017, looking at young people and seeing already how they consumed short-form video. We did like a transformation of the newsroom to be video-centric and to work with trying to ace digital storytelling, mobile first, with explainers, short news clips, and that's really paying off. So just trying to stay in touch and understand where the audience is going. So video starts actually thousand-folds since then. And we're also doing a lot of research, and I see a lot of, which I love, young people in the room, trying to understand, because the 20 to 40-year-olds in Sweden today is so different. They are actually more anxious, They are more pessimistic about the future. They're more family-oriented. They party less. And they spend more time with their families. And an important thing for us also, they are way more diverse. 40% of Swedes in this age group have a foreign background. So how can we be of service to that group? And we're also seeing a rise in news avoidance. And Rasmus actually wrote a great book about news avoidance, which I can recommend. So 50% of the people in the age group of 16 to 29 say they avoid news because it makes them, it puts them in a bad mood. So how can we change our content to also provide hope and solutions? And we are experiencing with a lot of formats trying. I mean, of course, so much in the world today is really dark, and we, of course, have to cover that. But how can we also look forward, asking about what will happen tomorrow, and try to understand this depressed state of mind. And I also know it's a global trend with isolation and loneliness. And also now with deepfakes and AI, you don't know what to trust. And I think it's such a deeply meaningful role for public service. How can we meet that? How can we, and we put in the strategy, but we have constructive news in our overall company strategy. We also have trying to create a sense of community and belonging, because when so much today is about tech, and it's really easy to get distracted by AI, and I do too, because it's a lot of shiny new things, but just trying to focus on, again, on the audience, and how, and I talked to Naja about just how can we be of true service. It's not always what the audience is asking for, but how can we understand true needs?
And this is pure coincidence, I promise, but you do come from the land of Hans Rosling and factfulness. And for those of you who have not come across the now sadly deceased Hans Rosling and his sort of notion of factfulness, simplifying and exaggerating, his core contention is that most of us in this room are dumber than monkeys because we are told that the world is a terrible place, even on issues where it is demonstrably getting better. So when Rosling and his collaborators ask multiple choice questions, we do worse than random, right? I mean, we are assuming here that a monkey would, with due respect to our, neighboring species, would do roughly randomly, and we do worse than that. So can you say a bit more about this? I mean, we like to think that journalism informs the people, but I mean, Rosling and sort of people who are aligned with him, we have Max Roser at the University of Oxford from Our World in Data, he and Hannah Ritchie, I think, broadly agrees with this, that journalism makes people dumber. Is this...
Yes, and we also make people believe that the world is a more dangerous place than it is. And we are so surprisingly good at finding solutions, but it hasn't been a core journalist, because if it's news, if it's leads, it bleeds. Mm-hmm. And how can we change the journalistic content? And it's so much fun to talk about that, because we speak a lot about face computers and formats, but this is changing journalism. And I'm also on the board of the Constructive News Institute, so I really love this.
I think the important thing here is not to advocate a single editorial response to it, but just to note that the contention here is not, and no one on the panel suggested that there is any moment at which journalism should avert its eyes from truly depressing and horrifying things happening in the world, Gaza, Ukraine, elsewhere.
Adding an angle.
It is adding that if the old line is, as Anne says, if it bleeds, it leads. I think we need to remember, if it bleeds, it leads to a dark and possibly ill-informed place.
And we might also create a sense that of hopelessness. It doesn't matter what I do in the world. It doesn't matter if I vote. But we need to create the sense that there are possible solutions, and instead of avoiding reporting about them, because then we can also create a diverted picture of the world. That it's, I mean, people are afraid of plane crashes because we report about them all the time, but not about car crashes, which is far more deadly.
Renée.
Yeah, to add exactly to something you mentioned, and that I think is absolutely vital to remaining relevant. In coming back to your nephew, the plumber, catastrophism, reporting series after series of what is real, very dark, very noir things happening in the world, and in general, the uncertainty, the transformational moment that we're in, the kind of epochal shift, like all these sort of big things that like we talk about and analyze and make more understandable because that's our job and we're in that environment, is not necessarily the environment that your nephew's in. So your nephew sees a series of really unpleasant pieces of news that reinforce a sense that perhaps something like elitist public service media is doing nothing but report bad things about the world and not sort of telling him things that he needs and uses. So what does that mean? I think that means that not only, yes, do we have to really understand what it means to be, what the service part of public service journalism is, but we're kind of good at that already. I think it's really about, more than ever, the responsibility of not just reporting the news, but of understanding how to look forward. It's never enough to say what happened. We now have more than ever responsibility to say how public institutions are responding, how private institutions are responding, how some governments and institutions aren't responding, who the actors are that are making a difference. And I think it's a shift in three things. One, in what we're actually reporting on. Two, in how we define a properly written story or a properly produced piece or a properly recorded podcast, whatever the format is. But it is never enough not to be forward-looking, is, I think, probably not always the case, but that is increasingly the sort of refrain that I'm trying to bring to life in my own newsroom, because I think that that's how to remain relevant. That's how to make it feel like to, the nephew plumber who's just not going to be wanting to tune in unless there's a sense of getting a sense of meaningfulness that's a reflection of what they're looking for without, as you were saying, Naja, even knowing that this is what you're looking for.
I have a last question that I would love to hear all three of you on, and then I think we should open it up. We've got lots of really smart people in the room, and many of them will have questions or things they want to contribute. So I think all of you have, in different ways, highlighted this, but I think it's maybe worth focusing on this in the last round, that public service media serve irreducibly diverse, often disputatious publics, and in the countries represented on this table, countries where the population is really changing in terms of composition, background orientation, lived experiences, self-identity, in a way where in the past, it was perhaps a useful fiction to imagine a relatively homogeneous majoritarian public that one was serving with sort of a one-size-fits-all, but that is not a useful fiction anymore. There are many European citizens who don't have the same sort of pork-chop-colored skin that I do, who may have roots in cultures and religions that are different from those that were in Europe in the early 20th century, that may think differently about gender and sexuality than much of mainstream society and most politicians. How do you think about that issue of serving a wider public and a more varied public, and a public that I think it's fair to suggest that some older people who look like me find confusing and frightening? How do you think about that?
So that's first off, societies have always been diverse, but back in the time where there were only one television channel, you were getting a very homogeneous look at the world, you know, and there were a lot of people that were not necessarily represented or heard. But since there were nothing else to do, you know, our numbers were very big. So this is why I'm not, if I'm honest, I think it is very natural that our overall reach are changing, because people don't, I mean, for God's sake, when I was young, people sat 7 hours on average on their couch watching whatever people were putting on the screen, and I don't think that was necessarily the top of human development, right?
It was pretty crap.
So, right, and I mean, and that, so now we've got people that have got choice, they can do what they want to. So even though our overall reach have declined, then our digital reach have really grown very fast. And that's, I take such a big comfort in that, because that's people choosing it. It's I think your numbers say 45% of the public every week. We know that we are reaching 6-7 million young people every week. They are choosing to spend time with us. We cannot force them to spend time with us, right? So that is number one. Number two, there is a row there, row number 5, where there is some of my colleagues. I can see Jess and Anna and Johnny. We've got a lot of people that are working day and night on trying out new formats, new ways of distribution, looking at data, but also testing things on communities, talking to communities, being with communities to figure out what is relevant to them. And I think maybe part of the secret sauce for public service, it is interesting because it's a bit counterintuitive. You would think that commercial media are the ones that are most led by audience insights. But I think some of the public service media, I think we are actually doing a pretty decent job here. I think we are self-critical, we're looking at the data, we are asking people, we are never afraid to receive feedback, and then we're never afraid to trying out stuff. And I want to call out a couple of things because like strategically, the media habits, they're changing in a way. So what used to be needed in a broadcast world, where you would need kind of a somewhat average version of the story that would be for today, the needs are now moving to either people wanting to follow a story live as it unfolds, and that can be big breaking news, it can be a terrible war outbreak, but it can also be something like Johnny that sits there. He did a whole 7-hour stream of an event in the Shetland Islands where people were dressed up like Vikings, and as a native Dane, that's a bit, I don't know what I think about that, but people were pretending to be Vikings and had this enormous event, and what we're seeing is people are gathering around big moments. And I think it is a very important public service task to allow people to belong, for us to be the place you can belong through. And we're doing that with our live pages and live streams. Then in the other end, that is, again, not that kind of average, everyday television package, is what we call added value. That is BBC Verify. We are very soon to launch a new brand that will show people what is our in-depth content, our analysis, explanation, also showing progress, you know, in, for instance, during the COP, in the end of last year, Justin Rowland, our environment editor, he was very good at explaining, but you know what, and things are not good, but actually there have been a lot of progress, and that is also due to the COPs. It's not as if all these meetings are not leading to anything. They are leading to actual things. And I think it is on us, so I think that's part of the constructive thing. It's not about looking for positive stories necessarily, it's about being honest about what is going on. So live on one hand, added value on the other hand. We're also putting a lot more money into investigations. And so in a way, it's things that are deeper, more immersive, better experiences, really worth your time. And then it is to be there when things happen. And that is very much what we see young audiences do. And the more it's almost like the more resources we put into those two areas, the bigger the audience is. And just to make it very specific, if you think about the Iran's drone attack last week, we are talking 17 million unique browsers coming to the coverage, right? So it's not, it's really a thing, you know, that everyone is coming to big events when they are unfolding. And then it's on us as public service to add explanation, verification, critical context and all of that in those moments, because during those moments is what I call the windows of attention. People are not going to wait until tomorrow or 4 days after to hear what the context is. They need to get that information while the things are unfolding. So the combination of live and depth, that is what we need to do.
Yeah.
Just 3 quick points. A few years ago, I met a Canadian woman called Susan Margetti, and she worked for the Canadian CBC. And they did focus groups asking a diverse audience, why are you not paying attention to public service? And they said, because you're old, you're white, and you're worried. So, and I love that, and I think we really need to change that. It's kind of painful because our newsrooms are not diverse enough, and that is still a problem, and we're too slow working on it. And I think the most successful thing we've done to become more diverse is that we could save a lot of money on transmission. So we actually doubled the amount of local newsrooms, so from 27 to 50, and that gets us a lot closer to the audience, so that was such a great move. And the third point I want to make is, being a small actor, you can also steal with pride. So we stole the BBC Verify idea, and the things you are doing there is just amazing. And it's also it's educational because you understand where is a story coming from, how are the Russian trolls working. So it's really, really impressive, Naja.
And it's the nicest compliment, right? If someone is stealing your ideas.
And
Renée.
openly.
Renée, do you want to comment on the diversity question?
Sure, thank you. And again, diversity for something like ARTE is complex because each of you is different. Each of you is looking at a national population, and indeed the UK and Sweden are places, I think, where diversification is massively accelerated when it comes to visible minorities and even voices of diversity. Here, you know, with ARTE, we are a European media. So the whole question of what a European identity is a big one. But the way we're thinking about diversity is almost more a question of identities that go across borders. So it's also questions of sexual diversity, questions of diversities of opinion, questions even of diversity of access to media, but also to, like, you know, the world and what you're meant to be, you know, and even your sense of what successful is, you know, what successful is, in a sense of basically social identities that go across borders. So, you know, that's complicated because you need to really then find stories to tell about an audience that maybe isn't yours yet, or isn't acquired yet, or isn't engaged yet. And you also need to not alienate your nephew, or not alienate the core, older, white person who is still the person probably mostly watching our broadcast news bulletins. So it is that very acrobatic aspect of doing, I think, what you were even alluding to earlier, Rasmus, which is we are able and sophisticated and experienced and old enough, actually, in terms of the infrastructure we have to produce news, to be able to think about audiences as diverse and to target different segments of audience with different kinds of content across different vectors. Interestingly, it's harder to organize that kind of, that'll be my last word, that kind of journalism internally. Because we, despite it being a public service network, you know, we all have limited resource. So we can't have, you know, 40 different newsrooms producing 40 different kinds of content for 40 different kinds of public. So it's a challenge of saying, well, what's multi-purposable across sectors and diversities, and what's not, and what's really important to be unique and to invest in. And it's the figuring out which segments of that audience, I think, are the most important, so to speak, in terms of the investment of our resources. That can be really hard and really controversial, even internally.
Thank you. I will ask my nephew whether he agrees that this is worth lugging toilets up to the 4th floor for, but I suspect he'd be open to being persuaded at least. I'm really sorry for having run this so far. We will take a couple of quick questions, so please raise your hand if you have a question, keep it short and direct it to one of the panelists ideally, and I will just get a sense of the public demand before we make some decisions. So can I ask the gentleman here in the second front row first? And then,
I'll try to be quick. So you are talking about shrinking advertising and public funding, but also the need to invest in new ways of reporting. So did you somehow take a step back? Did you disinvest from classic news services and broadcasting?
Thank you. I'll take one more question. There is a woman here at the back in the 4th row over near the door. I think here, yes, with the glasses in your hair. Thank you. So.
Thank you, Renate Schröder from the European Federation of Journalists. Short question regarding the BBC. Rasmus said at the beginning 11% less news. Why that for public service media? And local media being so important to connecting. We just published a study about all the news deserts in Europe, and BBC has also shortened a lot. It's very important, local media, radio, and so on. Thank you.
So just to be clear, 11% less reach, not less news, just to be clear. But I think both questions are very important. So divesting to invest, I think, Anne, you spoke about this, so are you happy to take that? And Naja, if you're willing to take the question about local from a BBC point of view.
Yes, 2 examples. We're shrinking our office space, which saves a lot of money, and we're looking into how to use AI subtitling, and we have 80 people working today with subtitling and translation, and of course that in the future we could also shift resources.
Naja, on local?
Yeah, and I would just say in December we announced changes to an old program called Newsnight, which meant the budget would be a lot smaller, and we actually think it would work better for the audiences as well. And then we, at the same time, announced that we are investing £5 million in digital jobs. So it's big money that needs to shift within these organizations to be audience-led. On the BBC, the overall reach, the reason why is because they would sat there in their couch watching BBC One all night, no matter what we put on. They also watch the news program. So it's by nature, and also don't forget, it's 80%, right? We're reaching 80% most days, right, with news. So it's not small. It's more like coming from an almost North Korean 100% to so I'm not underestimating it, but it's just I think when we talk about this, we always have to remember how much bigger the public service media are than all private media organizations, including some of those that are seen as very popular tabloids. We are still a lot bigger, and I think that is because it is written down in our regulation that we are here to serve everyone. I think it's because this is the kind of the condition on which we get the money.
So
so local we are, so absolutely our local newsrooms, they are going through a very big transformation where they are moving resources from radio first to producing more digital content, and all of that digital content is coming out through the BBC News app and website in localized manners.
I think this question about moving money is a key one, so thank you for asking that. And I think it's really important to be clear about just how hard that is in an organization where you have colleagues who are working on something who may not always be appreciative of what you're trying to do and have good reasons to be concerned sometimes. You have the external funding pressures as well. And you have very opinionated voices in public space who are ready to pounce on any change. Try to close an orchestra if you have one at a public service media organization, and you'll see the sort of lovies flock to the pages of liberal newspapers to criticize you. But to give you a sense of how important the question is that was raised, and again, I don't mean to knock on the BBC, but I think it just illustrates the scale of the challenge. In 2008, television and radio accounted for 73% of the time that people in the UK spent with media, and it accounted for 95% of BBC's public service spending, according to the BBC's own accounting of this. As of last year, television and radio combined accounts for about a third, so from 73% to about 36% of time spent with the media in the UK, and it accounts for 91% of the BBC's public service spend. It's very hard to change these things, as Naja and everyone on the panel knows. But it's nonetheless, as I think is implied, sometimes necessary. So thank you for leading on that change and working with your colleagues on that. Thank you to the volunteers and festival staff who make the panel possible, and thank you to the panelists for being on the panel.